Standing beside Tate's family and friends at his wedding was exactly what everyone expected Noah to do. Forgive Tate, smile, pretend the past no longer mattered, move on. Yeah, absolutely not. Noah wasn't going to attend a wedding to celebrate a Blue family milestone when Tate had made it painfully clear that he never wanted Noah to become part of the Blue family in the first place. Choosing not to go wasn't about revenge, bitterness, or making a statement. It was about self-preservation. It was about refusing to put himself through the emotional pain of standing there, applauding a future that had no place for him. Watching Tate exchange vows while surrounded by the family Noah had once dreamed of belonging to would have been a reminder of everything he had lost. The cost of attending was simply too high. Noah refused to sacrifice his own peace of mind just to make everyone else comfortable. Some invitations are easier to decline than the pain they require you to endure, and this was one of them. Noah couldn't prove it, but he was convinced the only reason Tate had invited him to the wedding was for appearances. Maybe Tate didn't actually want him there at all, or maybe he did, but only because inviting him was what everyone expected, not because he genuinely cared whether Noah came. Either way, Noah refused to validate Tate's choices. Tate had every right to leave, build his own life, get married, and start a family. Noah had never believed otherwise. What he couldn't accept was the way Tate had done it. The lies, the mixed signals, the emotional manipulation, and the complete lack of respect had left wounds that an invitation to a wedding couldn't erase. If Tate had treated a female friend the same way he had treated Noah, stringing her along, disappearing without giving her the dignity of an honest goodbye, and then inviting her to watch him marry someone else, no one would expect her to attend. In fact, most people would understand immediately why she stayed away. Noah saw no reason the standard should be any different for him. One of the biggest reasons Noah remained angry was the hypocrisy. Everyone expected Noah to forgive Tate, move on, and avoid making a scene, even though Tate had made a life-altering decision that directly affected Noah without ever telling him. Tate chose a different future, disappeared from Noah's life, and never gave him the courtesy of an honest conversation or even a goodbye. Years earlier, when Noah had gone on a cruise with Mark, he hadn't simply vanished. He left Tate a voicemail explaining where he was going, left a note, and fully intended to come back. Even with that reassurance, Tate reacted as though Noah had abandoned him. For months, Tate vented his anger by firing bullets at targets in the backyard because he couldn't cope with Noah being gone temporarily. Yet when Tate disappeared from Noah's life permanently, without a conversation, without a note, and without any warning, everyone expected Noah to accept it quietly. He was supposed to forgive, smile, and move on as if nothing had happened. That was the double standard Noah couldn't understand. Tate's temporary fear of losing Noah had been treated as understandable, while Noah's permanent loss of Tate was treated as something he was expected to get over. In Noah's eyes, Tate was given endless grace for his reactions, while Noah was criticized for having any reaction at all. To Noah, it felt as though different rules applied to Tate than to everyone else. Whether that was because of Tate's wealth, his social standing, his gender, or simply because people were accustomed to excusing his behavior, Noah couldn't say for certain. What he did know was that the imbalance felt impossible to ignore. Therapy had taught Noah an important lesson: match people's consistent behavior instead of their words. Tate had made his position painfully clear. When he walked away, he didn't think Noah deserved an explanation. He didn't leave a note, he didn't have a conversation, he didn't acknowledge that Noah's feelings mattered enough to warrant a goodbye. So Noah decided to meet Tate exactly where Tate had always met him. If Tate believed disappearing without a word was acceptable, then Noah saw no obligation to explain why he wasn't coming to the wedding. Tate and Chloe didn't need a letter, they didn't need a phone call, they would simply discover Noah wasn't there. You can't have it both ways. You can't choose to end someone's place in your life without empathy and then expect that same person to show up years later with understanding, compassion, and emotional support. You choose a lane and you stay in it. If you want to be treated like someone whose feelings matter, then you have to treat other people's feelings as if they matter too. To Noah, attending the wedding would have meant rewarding behavior that had devastated him. He refused to do that. Whether his decision appeared mature or childish no longer mattered to him. From Noah's perspective, Tate's actions had defined the terms of their relationship long ago. Noah wasn't trying to hurt Tate, he was simply responding with the same emotional distance Tate had shown him. If, on his wedding day, Tate found himself wondering why Noah wasn't there or whether he had ever truly been welcome in the celebration, then Tate would experience only a fraction of the uncertainty Noah had been forced to live with since the day Tate walked away without saying goodbye. Because Noah already knew what the wedding would look like, Tate is at the center of it, smiling, steady, surrounded by people who understood their place in his life in a way I never fully could, and next to him the future he had chosen, clear, public, undeniable, not hidden, not uncertain, not complicated. Whatever existed between us always felt on my side of it. And I would be there too if I went, not as someone important, not as someone who belonged in that picture, but as someone standing just outside the frame. I expected to smile like distance doesn't have weight. People kept saying things like, "We want you there and it won't be the same without you," like absence is just a missing decoration that can be filled in for symmetry. But they weren't the ones who would feel what it meant to sit through it in real time. They weren't the ones who would have to hold their expression steady while something inside them kept shifting out of place. The truth was simple, even if it hurt to admit. Tate was straight. That was never something I could change or compete with or reshape into something it wasn't. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't a choice he made against me. It just was. And I could understand that part even when understanding didn't soften anything. What I couldn't ignore, what stayed lodged under everything else, was how I had been treated inside the space I did occupy in his life. Because that part wasn't about orientation or fate or anything uncontrollable. That part was about behavior, about closeness that was given and taken back without warning, about being allowed near enough to feel significant, then pushed far enough to realize I wasn't actually essential. About moments where I mattered deeply in private ways and then didn't seem to matter at all when life got organized into something official, something structured, something that had room for a clearly defined future that didn't include me in the center of it. And now I was being invited to sit quietly and watch the final version of that arrangement, like I was supposed to clap for it, like I was supposed to turn up, take my place in the background, and accept that what I had felt, whatever it was, had simply been reassigned without consequence. It wasn't even anger most of the time. Anger would have been cleaner, easier to carry. This was something messier, something that felt like standing in a place you used to be allowed to live only to realize the door still opens for others, just not for you in the same way anymore. Not because you were banned, but because you were never meant to be permanent, and that realization is its own kind of removal. The Green Rambler had never been their house, it was Noah's house. Tate had bought it for Noah, but once the house was placed in Noah's name, it belonged to Noah legally, morally, and ethically. Tate had no ownership claim to it. When Noah invited Tate to move in, he wasn't moving into his own home. He was being welcomed into Noah's. Noah had made room for Tate because of everything they had shared growing up. He wanted Tate close. He wanted them to continue living side by side, sharing the same space, the same routines, and the same sense of home they had always known. Tate wasn't just given a key. He was given a place to belong, a drawer, part of a closet, a permanent place in Noah's daily life. That was why the way Tate left hurt so deeply. When Tate moved out, he treated Noah's home like nothing more than a temporary stopover. He packed garbage bags, walked out the door, and disappeared without a real goodbye, leaving his trash in the living room. There was no conversation, no acknowledgement of what Noah had shared with him, no recognition that someone had opened their home and their life to him for years. Noah didn't need a dramatic speech or an elaborate expression of gratitude, but he did believe Tate owed him something. A simple thank you, a goodbye, or even the basic respect of recognizing that Noah had made room for him in every sense of the word. Instead, Tate vanished as though he had been checking out of a hotel rather than leaving the home of someone who had loved him enough to make space for him. For Noah, that wasn't just inconsiderate, it was deeply disrespectful. It became one more reason he finally accepted that he was done chasing someone who had walked away as though none of it had ever mattered. Noah had handed Tate a key to the Green Rambler as if it were the most natural thing in the world, even though it was something he almost never did. The only other person who had a key was Susie. That wasn't because Noah trusted Susie more than anyone else. She simply lived closest to the house, right next to a bakery, and she would often stop by with donuts or pastries. It made sense for her to have one. Beyond that, Noah didn't really entertain people at his house. His friends had their own lives and there was rarely a reason for anyone to come over unannounced. His home was a private place. Tate was different. Giving Tate a key wasn't just about convenience. It was Noah's way of saying, "This is your home too, you're always welcome here." Tate was one of only 2 people Noah had ever trusted with unrestricted access to his personal space. Noah didn't make exceptions like that for just anyone. He made one for Tate because of their history, their closeness, and because he couldn't imagine a life where Tate wasn't part of his everyday world. That was why the way Tate left hurt so much. When he moved out, Tate simply tossed the key onto the kitchen island and walked away. No conversation, no goodbye, no acknowledgement of what the key had represented or of the years Noah had spent making room for him in his home and in his life. To Tate, it seemed like returning a key. To Noah, it felt like Tate was discarding the trust, the invitation, and the place Noah had always reserved for him. The silence hurt almost as much as the departure itself. Looking back, Noah realized he still carried resentment over those final moments. It wasn't simply that Tate had left. It was that he had treated Noah's home and Noah's trust as though they were no more meaningful than a temporary place to stay. For someone Noah had always considered family, that indifference was one of the hardest things to forgive. Before Noah ever gave Tate a key to the Green Rambler or invited him to move in, there was already an extraordinary level of trust between them. During the first few months after Tate had bought the Rambler for Noah, Noah would simply leave the front door unlocked whenever he knew Tate was coming over. Tate would quietly let himself in, lock the door behind him, walk down the hallway, climb the few stairs to Noah's bedroom, open the door without knocking, and slip beneath the duvet beside him. Noah trusted Tate completely. He was physically vulnerable around Tate in a way he wasn't with anyone else, and Tate never took advantage of that trust. Their closeness was effortless. There were no formal invitations, no need to announce his arrival, and no concern that Tate's presence would ever feel intrusive. It simply felt natural. Eventually, Noah gave Tate a key. To anyone else, it might have looked like an ordinary house key. To Noah, it represented something much greater. It was a permanent invitation. It meant, "You belong here, this is your home whenever you want it to be." The Green Rambler became their sanctuary. Although Noah didn't have rigid physical boundaries with his friends, they rarely came to his house because everyone usually met somewhere else. Tate was different. Tate had unrestricted access to Noah's life. He never had to ask where Noah was. He could let himself in at any hour, walk into the kitchen, grab something from the refrigerator, sit in the living room, or quietly make his way upstairs and climb into bed beside Noah. He never had to ask permission to stay the night. He simply belonged. It was an unusual kind of intimacy, one built on years of friendship, complete trust, and the quiet understanding that each of them always had a place in the other's life. If someone had told Noah back then that Tate would someday leave without a word, he would have laughed. He would have sworn on his mother's life that Tate would never treat him that way. Everything Tate had ever done suggested the exact opposite. Whenever Noah talked about leaving, Tate couldn't bear it. There were times Tate physically restrained Noah from walking away because he didn't want to lose him. He always found reasons to be close. He always wanted to sleep beside Noah. He acted as though the thought of Noah leaving was unbearable. Then on June 2nd, Tate became the one who walked away. No goodbye, no explanation, no letter, no acknowledgement of the life they had shared. That was the contradiction Noah could never reconcile. The man who had once acted as though he couldn't spend a night apart from Noah left as though the years they had shared required no explanation at all. In the days that followed, Noah couldn't stop asking himself the same painful question. Had the Green Rambler truly been a home to Tate, or had it simply been a convenient place to live without paying rent until he no longer needed it? Noah had no proof that Tate had used him. But after the way Tate left, discarding the key, abandoning the sanctuary they had built together, and disappearing without so much as a goodbye, he also had no evidence to convince himself otherwise. That uncertainty became one of the deepest wounds Tate left behind. Not abandonment in a dramatic sense, not being thrown away and forgotten like a wife during an unexpected divorce. Something quieter than that, something more humiliating in its simplicity. Like being a pet that someone once kept close, once fed, once led into the rhythm of their life, once allowed in its master's bed, only to be intentionally left behind without explanation. And then later, its master casually invites the abandoned dog to attend the celebration of his newly adopted dog that's taken your hallowed place. That's what it felt like, not hatred, not even disappointment in a loud way, just betrayal, humiliation, and intentional displacement. And being expected to smile through that kind of displacement, to sit in the front row of it like it doesn't rewrite everything you thought you were part of, felt like asking me to perform a version of myself that no longer existed. Noah had given up a great deal to remain loyal to Tate. From the time they were 18, Noah had opportunities to build a life with other people. He was approached by men who were interested in him and could have pursued meaningful relationships of his own. Instead, he chose to remain close to Tate. In the beginning, Noah's love for Tate had been romantic. As the years passed and it became clear that Tate was heterosexual and wanted a different future, those feelings evolved. The romance faded, but the love did not. It became something deeper and more enduring, a brotherhood, a companionship, a chosen family. Tate became Noah's closest friend, his confidant, and the person he trusted above everyone else. They were closer than brothers. Both had grown up as only children. Together, they created the sibling relationship neither of them had ever had. Tate defended Noah, protected him, and made him feel safe in ways Noah had rarely experienced with his own family. Through Tate, Noah felt as though he had finally found the family he had always longed for. For years, Noah organized his life around that bond. Whenever possible, he chose Tate first. There were times when his education, his work, his business, or his friendships required him to establish healthier boundaries, but even then, Tate remained the single most important person in his personal life. That was why Tate's departure felt like such a profound betrayal. It wasn't because Tate chose a different future. Noah never believed Tate owed him a romantic relationship or a lifetime of living together. If Tate had simply sat down with him, explained that his life was changing, said goodbye with honesty, and remained part of Noah's life in a different way, Noah believed he could have accepted it. It would have hurt. Their intimacy would have changed, their routines would have changed, their lives would have moved in different directions. But it would not have felt like betrayal. Instead, Tate disappeared without giving Noah the dignity of a conversation. The man Noah trusted most simply walked away, leaving Noah to make sense of the silence on his own. To Noah, it felt like the abandonment of a loyal dog that had spent years faithfully waiting beside the person it loved, only to discover one day that it had been left behind without explanation. That experience permanently changed the way Noah viewed Tate. Even if Tate returned one day, Noah didn't believe he could ever occupy the same place in Noah's heart again. Trust, once broken that completely, could never simply return to what it had been. From Noah's perspective, the lesson was painfully clear. Someone who could leave so completely, without explanation or goodbye, was someone capable of doing it again. Whether or not Tate ever came back, Noah no longer saw him as permanent. He saw him as temporary. And temporary people, no matter how deeply they were once loved, could never again be trusted with the most important place in Noah's life. When Tate left, Noah wasn't just grieving the loss of a friend, he was grieving the loss of the person he had built his emotional world around. Therapy eventually helped Noah understand that what he had been experiencing wasn't simply heartbreak, it was grief. Denial. At first, Noah couldn't believe Tate was really gone. He expected a phone call, a knock at the door, an apology, some explanation that would make everything make sense. For weeks and months, part of him believed there had to be a misunderstanding because the Tate he knew would never disappear without saying goodbye. If someone had told Noah years earlier that Tate would one day leave forever without a word, Noah would have sworn on his mother's life that it could never happen. That belief died the day Tate walked away. Anger. Once the reality settled in, the anger came. Noah wasn't angry that Tate wanted a different life. He wasn't angry that Tate wanted to marry or have a family. He was angry about how Tate chose to leave. Tate had spent years acting as though the thought of Noah leaving was unbearable. He had begged Noah to stay, insisted on sleeping beside him, defended him, and made Noah feel as though they would always be part of each other's lives. Then Tate became the one who disappeared. No goodbye. No conversation. No note. Nothing. The hypocrisy infuriated Noah. Everyone expected Noah to forgive Tate, attend the wedding, and celebrate Tate's happiness while dismissing the pain Tate had caused. Bargaining. For a long time, Noah replayed the past in his mind. What if Tate had simply sat down with him? What if Tate had explained that his life was changing? What if they had remained friends, even if they no longer lived together? Noah realized he could have accepted almost any ending except silence. He wasn't grieving because Tate moved on. He was grieving because Tate erased him from the process. Depression. Eventually, the anger gave way to sadness. The Green Rambler no longer felt like the sanctuary it once had been. The empty spaces in the house reminded Noah of routines that no longer existed. The bedroom where Tate used to quietly slip beneath the duvet. The kitchen was where they shared ordinary moments. The key Noah had given Tate was a symbol of trust. Everything became a reminder of someone who had once made Noah feel safe. For the first time, Noah questioned whether any of it had meant as much to Tate as it had to him. That uncertainty hurt more than certainty ever could. Acceptance. Acceptance didn't mean Noah forgave what had happened. It meant he finally accepted that Tate had shown him who he was willing to be. Therapy taught Noah that he could not base his expectations on the best version of someone or on years of happy memories. He had to judge people by their consistent behavior. Tate's final decision became part of that behavior. Noah stopped waiting for explanations. He stopped expecting closure. He stopped believing that the relationship could ever return to what it had once been. Acceptance also changed the way Noah loved Tate. For years, Tate had been the center of Noah's emotional life, the first person Noah thought about, the person he trusted most, and the person he believed would always be there. After June 2, that place in Noah's heart disappeared. Noah still loved Tate for the years they had shared. He always believed those memories were real. But love without trust was no longer enough. The man Noah once viewed as permanent became someone he viewed as temporary. Noah no longer saw Tate as the safest person in his life. He saw him as someone capable of leaving without warning. That realization permanently changed the way Noah thought about Tate. He would always remember who Tate had been. He would never again believe Tate was incapable of becoming the man who walked away. I kept receiving texts from a few of my friends urging me to come to the wedding reception which was being held the next day, June 11. Every message carried the same sentiment: just come, be the bigger person, show up. I refused. For once, I wasn't making my decision based on what everyone else wanted. I was making it based on what I needed. I didn't care that Tate, Chloe, their families, or their friends might have to answer uncomfortable questions about why Tate's closest buddy of 22 years wasn't there. I didn't care if people whispered about why the man standing beside Tate wasn't the guy who had shared nearly every chapter of his life. Those questions weren't mine to answer. They were a consequence of Tate's choices, not mine. Tate had chosen to leave our relationship without giving me the dignity of a goodbye. He had chosen a future that no longer included me. If people noticed my absence and wondered why my closest friend for 22 years wasn't celebrating beside him, that wasn't something I was responsible for fixing. For years, I had protected Tate from awkward conversations, uncomfortable truths, and difficult emotions. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. If anyone asked where I was, they could answer however they wanted. I had already spent enough of my life carrying the emotional consequences of Tate's decisions. I wasn't going to carry the social consequences either. I had no intention of easing the awkward questions of well-wishers, wondering where I was, or making an appearance to satisfy my friends and surrogate family. I would use a play out of Tate's life manual and get laid instead of attending a shrine to a heteronormative milestone. I chose instead to stay away, not to make a statement, not to punish anyone. But because I knew exactly what sitting there would do to me, and I wasn't willing to pretend I was unaffected just to make someone else's day feel complete or comfortable. June 11th came, but it didn't feel like a date so much as something I had been bracing for without admitting it. I woke up around 2 in the afternoon, still half stuck in the weight of the night before. Drinking hadn't solved anything, it never did, but it had done what it always did best: blur the edges just enough that I didn't have to sit fully inside my own thoughts. The problem was that eventually the blur lifts, and when it does, everything is still there waiting. My phone was the first thing I saw. 12 missed calls, different numbers, different names, same urgency behind all of them, everyone except Tate and Chloe. That detail shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it landed anyway. Quiet, uncomfortable, like something I didn't want to interpret too closely in case it meant more than I was ready to accept. Voicemails stacked up after that, one after another, like people trying to build a bridge out of words if they just kept adding enough of them. Susie's voice showed up the most, repeated, predictable, every 10 minutes, like she had set her day around me not answering. I finally let one play long enough to understand the pattern. Move on, don't make this harder, everyone will understand if you just show up. It would mean a lot if you came tonight. The rehearsal dinner was today, of course it was, the part before the real thing, the warm-up to something I was already not supposed to witness. I didn't listen to any of them, I didn't need to. The message was always the same, just dressed in different sentences: be there so we don't have to feel your absence. But I didn't want to be a symbol of anything, not healing, not maturity, not proof that I was okay, because I wasn't okay in a way that could be packaged neatly for other people's comfort. I stayed in the house instead, curtains drawn, lights off, without me even deciding to make it dramatic. The silence wasn't peaceful, but it was at least mine. No one is asking me to explain it. No one is trying to interpret it into something easier. 7 o'clock came without ceremony, and then the knocking started. Hard, repeated, not polite, not uncertain. It didn't sound like someone who would leave if I ignored it. I froze for a second, just listening. The sound filled the space, pushing through the walls, pulling me out of the false safety of stillness. My phone sat somewhere nearby, quiet now, but still heavy with everything it had already tried to say for me. The knocking came again. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't go to the door. I stayed where I was and let the house stay dark with me, as if I didn't acknowledge the outside world. I could delay whatever version of this moment they had decided I was supposed to have. The knocking stopped around 9. Not because anything was resolved, not because I answered, and not because I was suddenly brave enough to face whatever version of reality was waiting on the other side of the door. It just stopped, like whoever it was had decided they had reached the limit of what they could take from a closed house. The silence afterward felt different, not peaceful, just final in a way that made the air heavier. I waited a while anyway, standing in the dimness, listening for any return of it. When nothing came back, I finally moved. I pulled on my coat slowly, like my body was still negotiating whether any of this was a good idea, and headed out the back instead of the front. Not because it mattered logically, but because it felt easier than walking past the place where someone had been trying to get to me. My car was already there. A BMW SUV, new, clean, expensive in the quiet way that didn't need to announce itself. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just comfortable, reliable, the kind of purchase that doesn't fix anything but makes the space around your life feel slightly more controlled. I got in and started it, and the engine responded like it didn't care what day it was or what I was avoiding. Driving helped in the way it always did. Not healing, not clarity, just motion. Something to occupy the part of my mind that didn't know what to do with stillness anymore. I told myself I had a life, and in a technical sense I did. I had friends. I had parents who called and checked in and expected me to show up for things. I had places I could go and people who would sit across from me and talk about normal things like work, weather, and plans for next week. From the outside, nothing about me looked empty. But that wasn't the part anyone could see. It was the absence that lived in the background of everything, not dramatic loneliness, not the kind that announces itself in obvious ways, something quieter, more persistent, the kind that settles into routines and doesn't leave just because your schedule is full. It's what happens when your body remembers something your life no longer has. I didn't even think of it in words most of the time. It was more physical than that. An old familiarity that my mind kept reaching for without permission, like muscle memory for a person who used to be there in small, constant ways. The weight of someone beside you without effort. The presence that made silence feel shared instead of empty. The feeling of being anchored to another human being so consistently that you stop noticing where you end and they begin. And then one day you notice, because it's gone, and your body doesn't stop expecting it. That was the part no one really understood when they told me to move on or focus on what I have or fill my time. Time didn't fill that kind of space, friends didn't replace it, the family didn't reach it. It wasn't about access or availability. It was about a kind of closeness you don't notice until it disappears, and suddenly every night feels like something is missing from the room itself. I hadn't slept through an entire night in over a year. That part was simple and brutal at the same time. Not dramatic insomnia with reasons I could list or fix, just a body that never fully relaxed anymore. Light sleep, half waking, shifting through hours without ever really dropping all the way under. Like part of me was still waiting for something that used to be there and never came back. In a way, I finally understood how Tate had felt when we were 18. Back then, he couldn't sleep without me. Now I was the one facing the same problem. I slept maybe 4 hours at a time, and even then it was never restful. I always woke up exhausted, as though I had never truly fallen asleep. I had grown so accustomed to Tate's heavy physique draped over me while we slept that my body no longer knew how to relax without him. His weight made me feel safe, warm, protected, and deeply loved. It was the one place where my mind could finally become quiet. Now, when I reached across the bed, there was only empty space. Without Tate wrapped around me, sleep no longer brought comfort. My body remained tense, waiting for the familiar warmth that never came. Most nights I cried myself to sleep. Sometimes it wasn't until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning that exhaustion finally overcame me. Even then, sleep never lasted very long. I'd wake up after a few hours, my chest aching with the same emptiness I'd fallen asleep with. Nights were always the hardest. During the day I could distract myself, but once the house grew quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, there was nowhere left to hide from the silence Tate had left behind. I'm sure Talia and Susie assumed I wasn't attending the wedding because they thought Tate didn't love me the way I had loved him. Maybe they believed I couldn't bear to watch him marry someone else, or that my feelings were simply too overwhelming. The truth was much more complicated than that. That part of my life had ended almost 10 years earlier. I had already accepted that Tate couldn't love me back in the way I had once hoped. Coming to terms with that had taken years, but eventually I made peace with it. It hurt, but it was a hurt I had learned to live with. The wedding wasn't what broke me, it wasn't seeing Tate move on. I refused to attend because of the way he had left me. You don't spend years sharing a home with someone, building a life together, falling asleep tangled together every night and waking up to the same familiar face every morning, only for it all to end without a word. Our names had become almost synonymous. People rarely spoke of one of us without mentioning the other. We were simply Noah and Tate. Then one night he packed his things and disappeared. No goodbye. No explanation. No phone call. No letter. No chance to see him one last time. Just complete abandonment. It felt as though someone had amputated one of my limbs while I was asleep and never bothered to tell me. I woke up reaching for something that wasn't there anymore, wondering why every movement hurt. The bleeding wasn't physical, but it was every bit as real. I was left to mourn someone who was still alive, forced to grieve a relationship that had ended without warning or closure. That was why I couldn't bring myself to attend the wedding. It wasn't because Tate didn't love me the way I once wished he could. It was because the person I trusted most had vanished from my life overnight, leaving me to pick up the pieces completely alone. The one thing that truly bothered me about the whole incident wasn't simply that Tate had left in the middle of the night. As painful as that was, it wasn't the part I struggled to understand. What haunted me was how completely he disappeared. This was the same Tate who had broken down doors just to get to me. The same Tate who had taken screwdrivers to hinges when a locked bedroom door stood between us. He had ignored every boundary I tried to set because, in his mind, sleeping beside me wasn't optional, it was something he needed. If he couldn't get into the room, he'd find another way. If I tried to create distance, he'd close it. He had even attacked Mark because he perceived him as competition for my time and physical closeness, despite the fact that my relationship with Mark was entirely platonic. Tate had always been possessive of my presence. He wanted to be near me constantly, as though simply sharing the same space gave him a sense of security. Then almost overnight, everything changed. The man who once couldn't tolerate being separated from me suddenly didn't seem to want to be in the same neighborhood. He didn't want to be on the same side of town. It was as though a switch had been flipped. The person who had once followed me everywhere, who always found a way back to me, simply vanished. He had gone from being almost comically inseparable, like Pepe Le Pew, always appearing at my side whether I wanted him there or not, to becoming nothing more than a shadow. He never called, he never visited, he never appeared on my doorstep again. It was as if he had erased himself from my life completely. That abrupt reversal was what I could never reconcile. I could understand someone slowly drifting away. I could understand two people growing apart over time. What I couldn't understand was how someone who had once fought so fiercely just to be close to me could suddenly disappear without a trace, less than 24 hours since they had shared domestic bliss, leaving behind only silence where there had once been constant companionship. Even the last night Tate and I shared a bed gave me no reason to believe anything was about to change. He held me the same way he always had. If anything, he held me even closer. There was no difference in his temperament, no emotional distance, no hesitation in his touch. If someone had asked me whether Tate seemed different during those final hours, I honestly would have said the opposite. He clung to me more than he had the night before. He left even less space between us, wrapping his arms around me so tightly that I could barely shift positions without moving him too. His grip felt almost desperate, as though I were a Christmas present he knew would soon be taken away before he had finished enjoying it. Looking back, that memory became almost impossible to reconcile with what happened next. How could someone hold another person that closely one night and then disappear from their life the next morning? It wasn't as though he had been slowly preparing me for his absence. There had been no cooling of affection, no decrease in physical closeness, no signs that he wanted independence or distance. If anything, his need to be close to me seemed stronger than ever during those final hours. Then without warning he was simply gone. It wasn't a gradual pulling away. It wasn't weeks of unanswered calls or fewer visits. It wasn't a relationship fatting over time. It happened overnight. There were no red flags, no subtle shift in his personality, no indication that he was planning to leave my life. One day he was wrapped around me, holding me as though he never wanted to let go. The next day it was as though he had ceased to exist. The emotional whiplash was overwhelming. My mind kept searching for the moment everything had changed, but there wasn't one. I replayed that last night over and over, looking for some clue I had missed, some sentence, expression, or hesitation that might explain what came afterward. I never found one. For days, I wasn't even sure what reality I was living in. I couldn't tell whether Tate was deliberately avoiding me or whether he had simply moved somewhere else, and our lives no longer crossed naturally. It almost seemed impossible that two people who had spent nearly every day together for decades could suddenly never run into each other by chance. That uncertainty made everything worse. At least if I had known he was avoiding me, I could have accepted that he had made a choice. Instead, I was left wondering whether I was looking in all the wrong places, whether tomorrow might be the day I saw him again, or whether I had already seen him for the last time without realizing it. That was the hardest part. There was no ending, only an absence that appeared overnight without explanation, leaving me to make sense of a silence that never should have existed in the first place. I didn't know how to explain that to anyone without it sounding like I was trying to turn it into something bigger than it was, or maybe smaller than it was, because either way, it never landed correctly. If Tate and I had merely shared a house, if we'd just been roommates splitting the bills, occasionally watching a movie together or moving in the same social circles, I could have understood us eventually going our separate ways. Even then, disappearing without a word would have been incredibly rude. You don't just empty out your belongings, clean out a third of the house, and vanish without leaving so much as a note explaining where you've gone. But that wasn't who we were. We hadn't simply shared an address. We had shared our lives. We had built routines around each other, depended on each other, and woven ourselves into one another's daily existence so completely that it was difficult to imagine one without the other. Our home wasn't just a place we happened to sleep. It was our home. Every room held reminders of a life we'd built together, and nearly a third of everything inside belonged to Tate. Then, almost overnight, it was gone. No explanation. No goodbye. Not even a handwritten note saying, "I'm sorry." A week passed and Tate still hadn't reached out. He hadn't called. He hadn't written. He changed his phone number. He hadn't asked one of our mutual friends how I was doing or asked them to tell me he hoped I was okay. As far as I knew, I had simply ceased to exist in his world. That was the part I couldn't reconcile. Intimacy comes with responsibility. When you spend years making someone part of your everyday life, sharing a home, sharing a bed, sharing meals, holidays, worries, victories, and quiet moments, you don't simply disappear because your life has changed. Even if you decide to move on, you owe that person honesty. You owe them closure. You owe them enough respect to make sure they don't spend months wondering what happened. Instead, it felt as though Tate had accepted every privilege our relationship offered: the companionship, the affection, the loyalty, the constancy, the comfort of always having someone beside him, without fulfilling the one responsibility that mattered most when it ended: making sure the person he was leaving behind didn't feel forgotten. You don't have to keep someone in your life forever. But you also don't leave them believing they meant nothing. You don't vanish so completely that the person who loved and trusted you begins questioning whether the relationship they remember was ever real. That silence hurt more than any difficult conversation ever could have. His absence didn't feel like the natural end of an important relationship. It felt like a death. The only difference was that there was no funeral, no condolences, and no certainty. I couldn't mourn him because he was still alive. I couldn't move on because there had been no ending. I was left grieving someone who had simply walked out of my life without looking back, carrying on as though the years we'd shared required no goodbye at all. To Tate's friends and family, my attending his wedding to Chloe seemed like the obvious expectation. Even if there had been bad blood between us, they believed I should still go. Some thought I should be there for our mutual friends. Others said I should attend to support Talia. A few believed it would be healthier to put everything behind me, that enough time had passed, that I should forgive Tate, move on, and not let the past overshadow an important day. From their perspective, it wasn't worth making into such a big issue. They were wrong. Some things you simply don't get over. Some wounds don't disappear because enough birthdays have passed or because everyone else has decided they're tired of hearing about them. Time doesn't automatically heal an injury that was never acknowledged. It only teaches you how to live with it. And when the person who caused that wound was Tate, it became even more complicated. This wasn't about missing a wedding. It wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about refusing to celebrate his happiness. It was about the fact that the last meaningful thing Tate had ever done to me was abandon me without explanation after more than 22 years of building a life together. Everyone wanted me to skip straight to forgiveness. Almost no one stopped to ask whether there had ever been accountability. For most of his life, Tate rarely had to sit with the consequences of his choices. He would make impulsive or emotionally driven decisions, and somehow the people around him, including me, would absorb the fallout. We explained his behavior, we softened it, we found reasons for it, we reassured ourselves that he didn't mean any harm. Looking back, I realized how often we had protected him from the natural consequences of his actions. I didn't want to admit it because I loved him. But Tate's parents, our relatives, our friends, and even I had spent decades making excuses for his thoughtlessness whenever it hurt someone else. We interpreted selfishness as immaturity. We dismissed a lack of consideration as absent-mindedness. We excused behavior that should have been confronted because it was easier to believe Tate simply didn't realize what he was doing. Whether that was true or not, the outcome was the same. He rarely had to experience what it felt like for someone to say, "No, what you did wasn't okay." By the time the wedding arrived, everyone expected me to be the one who showed grace. I was expected to overlook the abandonment, smile for photographs, congratulate him, and pretend our last chapter together hadn't ended with complete silence. I couldn't do that. Not because I hated Tate. I hated what Tate had done to me. Not because I wanted revenge. But because pretending nothing had happened would have required me to deny my own experience. It would have meant acting as though the deepest hurt I'd ever experienced was merely a misunderstanding that everyone else had already decided I should forget. Some actions leave scars that don't disappear simply because other people are uncomfortable looking at them. This was one of those scars. My family and friends wanted me to attend the wedding as a sign of good faith. They thought showing up would prove I was taking the high road, that I was willing to put the past behind me for the sake of everyone else. They didn't want tension hanging over future family gatherings, holidays, Sunday dinners, or celebrations. In their minds, my presence would smooth everything over and prevent an awkward divide from forming. I understood why they felt that way. Nobody wanted our fractured relationship to become the invisible elephant in the room every time the family gathered. They wanted peace. They wanted everyone to move forward as though enough time had passed for the hurt to fade. The problem was that they were asking the wrong person to make peace. Nobody wanted to sit with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes our decisions have lasting consequences. Not every wound heals simply because time passes. Some relationships don't return to what they once were, not because someone refused to forgive, but because trust was never rebuilt. People often talk about forgiveness as though it's something you're obligated to give regardless of what the other person has done afterward. I don't believe that's true. Forgiveness without accountability isn't always forgiveness. Sometimes it's enabling. Tate never explained why he disappeared. He never apologized for the way he left. He never acknowledged the pain his actions caused. He never tried to repair what had been broken. Instead, everyone expected me to absorb the hurt quietly, smile politely, and behave as though nothing significant had happened. That wasn't healing. That was pretending. If I had attended the wedding simply to keep everyone else comfortable, it would have sent a message I wasn't willing to send. It would have suggested that someone could abandon another person without explanation, offer no apology, make no effort to repair the damage, and still expect everything to return to normal because enough time had passed. I couldn't do that. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to create drama. But because actions have consequences and relationships require accountability. I wasn't going to help reinforce the idea that someone could treat another person carelessly, never acknowledge the harm they caused, and still receive the same closeness and acceptance they had before. If Tate walked away believing there were no consequences for the way he had treated me, what incentive would he have to do anything differently the next time he hurt someone? I wasn't going to become another example of someone who took it like a champ so everyone else could stay comfortable. Sometimes the most honest response to being deeply hurt isn't creating conflict. It's simply refusing to pretend that nothing happened. Looking back, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that Tate acted as though he could do no wrong. Other people's feelings often seemed like inconveniences rather than something worthy of consideration. Over the years, Noah had watched Tate move through relationships with an ease that sometimes felt unsettling. Girls, members of his own family, even his mother, when someone no longer fit into what Tate wanted, he could walk away with remarkable detachment. If a girl got hurt because Tate decided after one night that she wasn't the one, he seemed to treat that as her problem, not his. Back in high school, cheerleaders whispered in the girls' bathroom, wondering why Tate appeared to care so much more about Noah's feelings than theirs. Noah never had an answer for them. At the time, he genuinely believed Tate loved him in a way that made him different from everyone else. Years later, he thought he finally understood. It wasn't that Tate cared more about Noah's feelings. It was that, for a very long time, what Noah wanted happened to align perfectly with what Tate wanted. As long as they wanted the same things, it was easy to mistake Tate's happiness for consideration of Noah's feelings. Their interests overlapped so completely that the distinction was almost invisible. Noah believed his feelings mattered because Tate's actions consistently made him feel valued, heard, and chosen. But when the two finally wanted different things, Noah's illusion collapsed. Tate left. He didn't ask what Noah wanted. He didn't ask how Noah would cope. He didn't explain his decision or try to soften the blow. He simply made the choice that suited him and expected Noah to live with the consequences. That was when Noah began questioning everything he thought he knew about their relationship. Maybe Tate had always seemed so considerate because their desires had pointed in the same direction. Maybe everyone, including Noah himself, had mistaken that coincidence for selflessness. If Tate wanted something that Noah didn't, then Noah's feelings were no longer part of the equation. That realization hurt more than the abandonment itself. It forced Noah to wonder whether he had ever truly been considered at all, or whether he'd simply been fortunate that, for 22 years, what Tate wanted and what Noah wanted had happened to be the very same thing. Noah had begun to wonder if Tate would do almost anything to get what he wanted, even if it meant stepping on someone's heart along the way. That was the part that hurt the most, the possibility that, when Tate made a decision, the damage left behind wasn't enough to make him stop. Madison had said something similar in the bathroom the day before Noah's 18th birthday. She had described Tate as a charmer, someone whose charisma could make people overlook the way he treated them. She had called him a narcissist, someone who could make people feel special while still putting his own desires first. At the time, Noah didn't want to believe her. He had seen Tate's flaws, but he had also seen the side of Tate that other people didn't. The tenderness, the affection, the way Tate looked for him in a crowded room, the way he seemed to need him close. Noah thought that made their relationship different. He thought that because he had stayed longer than everyone else, because he had been the one person Tate never walked away from, it meant something deeper. He believed endurance was proof of importance. But maybe that had been Noah's mistake. Maybe staying didn't mean he was irreplaceable. Maybe it only meant Tate had found someone who was willing to remain. Noah couldn't stop thinking about the way Tate had called him his truck. At the time, it had felt like an affectionate nickname, something private between them. It was a reminder of how playful and comfortable they were together. But after everything that happened, Noah started wondering whether Tate had unknowingly revealed how he saw him. Was Noah someone Tate loved, or was he something Tate enjoyed having? Was he a person Tate valued, or a source of comfort Tate didn't want to lose? The thought was painful because Noah had spent so many years believing the good things Tate said were proof of love. He believed every compliment, every embrace, every promise that he mattered. Now he wondered whether those words had been less about Noah and more about keeping him close. Maybe Tate didn't want to lose him because losing Noah meant losing the comfort, attention, and security Noah provided. Maybe Tate didn't want him. Maybe Tate just didn't want to be alone. And Noah knew those two things were not the same. Being needed was not the same as being loved. Being someone's comfort was not the same as being someone's choice. That was the question Noah was left carrying, whether Tate had truly seen him as a person he couldn't live without or simply as something familiar he never imagined having to live without. The car kept moving through the dark streets, steady and unbothered. I watched the road without really seeing it, just letting the motion carry me forward while everything else stayed behind in the house I had just left. I wasn't running from anything specific. I was just trying not to sit still long enough to feel how empty quiet could get when it had nowhere else to go. The blue warehouse on South Vermont Avenue was where I ended up every time my life hit rock bottom. I didn't choose it in any meaningful way at first. It just became the place my car kept drifting toward when everything with Tate started falling apart again, when the lies stopped making sense, when the distance between what he said and what he did became impossible to ignore. Tate's betrayals involving Emily, Tina, and Chloe were the reasons I drove here to cope with Tate's failings. Tate had been with them, separately, quietly, like I was never meant to connect the dots. This warehouse comforted me in ways Tate couldn't or wouldn't. Not just another stop, not just a quiet corner of town that happened to be empty at night, but the place my mind kept returning to whenever everything else felt too loud to hold. The tree, the cracked asphalt, the way the building loomed there like it had seen too many people come and go without ever asking them to stay. And it wasn't just tonight that made it feel heavy. It went back further, back to my 18th birthday, the night I slept here because I couldn't stay anywhere else. Emily and Tate had already been together then, officially, clearly, in a way that didn't leave room for misunderstanding or hope or reinterpretation. I remember finding out in fragments too, not one clean moment, but a slow realization that settled into me the way cold air does when you don't notice the window has been open the whole time. It wasn't dramatic on the outside, that was the strange part. Life kept moving, people still talked, things still happened around me. But inside something had shifted in a way I didn't have language for yet. I just knew I couldn't go home the way everyone expected me to that night. I couldn't sit in a room and pretend I was fine. I couldn't stay in spaces that suddenly felt too small for everything I was trying not to feel. So I ended up here, in this parking lot, under this same tree, in my car, engine off, staring at nothing until my thoughts stopped trying to organize themselves into something I could explain. That was the first time I learned what it felt like to be physically somewhere while emotionally nowhere at all. I didn't cry in any dramatic way, I didn't have a big collapse. It was quieter than that, just a slow sinking feeling like something inside me had stepped back from the rest of my life and didn't know how to return. I remember thinking I would leave soon, that I just needed a few minutes. Then a few hours passed, then the night changed shape. I started coming here more often, parking near the warehouse instead of going home. Sitting in my car with the engine off like I could hold myself together better if I didn't move. It didn't make logical sense what I felt here. That was the first thing I always tried to correct in my head, like numbing the flaw would fix it. Like if I could just admit it was irrational it would stop being real, but it didn't stop. Tate had never been to this place, not once as far as I knew. There was no shared history between him and this rusted blue-painted building. No firsts, no memories, no conversations that should have left echoes behind in the gravel or the metal beams or the broken light above the loading door. Nothing that should have tied him here. And still, every time I sat in the quiet, I felt him. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't like seeing him standing there or hearing his voice in any literal way. It was subtler than that and somehow worse for it, like the air itself had learned his shape. Like the space beside me in the passenger seat wasn't fully empty even when it clearly was. A presence without evidence, a certainty without proof, just him. It almost made me angry sometimes the way my mind insisted on it. As if it didn't care what had actually happened, what he had actually done, what I had learned piece by piece until I couldn't pretend I hadn't learned it anymore. The warehouse didn't look like anything important from the outside. That was part of why it worked. It didn't demand attention. It didn't ask questions. It just existed, heavy and indifferent, like it had seen enough of other people's problems to stop caring about mine. The paint was still that faded blue that looked almost gray in low light. The edges of the building were softened by neglect. A chain-link fence that didn't quite close properly on the far side. A lot of it stayed half empty no matter what time I came. There was something comforting about that emptiness, even when I didn't want to admit it, because emptiness didn't ask me to explain anything. My car became part of the routine without ever being invited into it properly. Engine off, hands resting somewhere they didn't have to do anything. Windows cracked just enough to let the air in, even when it didn't change much. The world outside was continuing like normal while I sat still inside a version of it that didn't quite feel like it belonged to anyone else. At first, I told myself I was just waiting things out, waiting for the feeling to pass, waiting for the thoughts to organize themselves into something I could manage again, waiting for Tate to stop feeling like the center of everything even when he wasn't physically present in any of it. But the waiting never really resolved into anything. Instead, it became repetitive. I'd arrive, I'd sit, I'd think I could leave in 10 minutes, then 20, then longer. And eventually the idea of leaving felt heavier than staying, like movement itself required more energy than I had available. That was when I started noticing the pattern. Not just that I came here when things were bad, but that I came here specifically when they involved him. When he was the reason I couldn't sleep. When conversations replayed too loudly in my head. When I caught myself reinterpreting things he said, trying to find versions of them that didn't hurt as much as the original meanings did. This place became the endpoint of that loop, and that's when the strangest part started, the feeling. It never came right away. It usually waited until I'd been sitting long enough that my thoughts had slowed down, until the noise in my head had thinned out just enough for something else to slip in underneath it. At first, it was subtle, easy to dismiss. A sense of attention without direction, like being observed without a source. Then it would deepen, and suddenly the empty passenger seat didn't feel empty anymore in the way empty usually feels. It felt occupied by something that didn't have to take form to be present. Tate, not his memory, not his imagination, just Tate. I tried more than once to break it down into something rational: stress, pattern association, emotional conditioning. The brain fills silence with the most dominant figure attached to unresolved emotion. That explanation almost worked, but it didn't account for the consistency, the way it only happened here, the way it didn't happen anywhere else with the same intensity. The way I could sit in completely different places, surrounded by noise or people or movement, and never feel it the same way I did in this parking lot beside a warehouse that meant nothing on paper. Here, it always came back, like this place had agreed to hold him for me. That thought made no sense either, but it kept returning anyway. The worst part wasn't the presence itself. It was what it did to me, because it softened the edges of everything else. It made anger harder to sustain, it made clarity slip, it made the betrayal feel less sharp for a moment, like distance had been introduced where there shouldn't have been any, and that terrified me more than the anger ever did, because anger at least meant I knew where I stood, but this blurred it. Some nights I'd sit there and replay everything again, trying to keep it linear, trying to keep it contained. Tate said this, then this happened, then I learned this, then I couldn't unlearn it. But even while doing that, even while trying to keep the structure intact, there would be this other layer underneath it, something quieter pulling in the opposite direction. A sense that he was still near, not physically, not logically, but near in the way unfinished things stay near you even when you've walked away from them. Like the ending hadn't fully decided it was an ending yet. I hated that part most, because it made everything harder to close, and I needed things to close. I needed them to resolve cleanly into something I could understand and leave behind. Instead, I got this place, and him, and the strange way they overlapped in my mind, even though they had no right to overlap at all. There were nights when I'd sit longer than I meant to, watching the light above the warehouse flicker in uneven intervals, thinking about how indifferent the world looked when nothing was actively falling apart in front of it. Those were the nights when the feeling was strongest, not loud, just close enough that I'd sometimes turn my head slightly, expecting nothing, and still feel like I was interrupting something by moving. And in those moments, I'd wonder if it wasn't really about Tate being here at all, if maybe it was about what my mind had decided he represented: distance I couldn't bridge, truth I couldn't fully hold without losing something in the process. A version of him that still existed somewhere between what happened and what I could bear to fully accept. The warehouse didn't answer those questions, it just stayed still. Blue and weathered and indifferent, and I stayed too, sitting in the quiet, letting the engine stay off, letting the feeling come and go the way it always did, not because I believed it was real in any way I could prove, but because here even uncertainty felt like a kind of company. Sun receded behind the mountains and the clouds as the darkness settled over South Vermont Avenue, the kind of slow fading light that made everything feel further away than it actually was. I sat in my car a moment longer than I needed to. Engine off, top down. The air was cooler now, sharp in a way that didn't belong to LA even though it did. The warehouse sat across the lot like it always did, unchanged, indifferent, its blue paint dimming into gray as the last of the daylight drained out of it. Usually I stayed in the car, that was the pattern, that was the boundary I never crossed, but tonight something in me didn't stay put. I opened the door. The sound of it felt too loud in the quiet metal hinge, a small echo that disappeared too quickly into the open space. I stepped out and stood for a second beside the car like I was checking whether I was actually going to do this or just thinking about doing it. The warehouse didn't react, it never did. Still, it looked different from this angle, bigger, less like a backdrop and more like something that had been waiting unused for a long time. I crossed the lot. Each step felt separate from the last, like I was counting without meaning to. Gravel shifted under my shoes. The air smelled faintly like dust and old metal and something colder underneath it. The side door wasn't locked. It never looked like it should open, but it did, with a low protest of metal that hadn't been asked to move in a while. Inside, the air changed immediately. Cooler, stiller, thicker in a way that made sound feel careful. I had never been inside before. That thought repeated itself as I stepped fully into the warehouse. I had built so much meaning around this place without ever actually crossing this line, sitting outside, watching it, letting it hold whatever I needed it to hold from a distance, but distance had started to feel different lately, less like safety, more like waiting. I reached for the wall instinctively. The surface was rough, unfinished in places, cold under my palm. The warehouse was larger than it looked from the outside, wide open floor space, beams overhead disappearing into shadow, old equipment pushed into corners like it had been forgotten mid-use. It didn't feel abandoned, it felt paused. There was glass on the floor, most things inside were knocked over, and I could smell and see dried cum and blood on the floor. Large pools of dried blood stained the concrete floor, surrounded by dozens of old semen stains. The sight made Noah's stomach turn. This must be a popular hookup spot. The thought only made the place feel more disturbing. Who would want to meet someone here? The building had long since been abandoned. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and mold, rusty pipes dripped steadily from the ceiling, and every surface was coated in layers of grime and dust. There wasn't a single clean place to sit, let alone lean against. To Noah, the whole place felt less like somewhere people came together and more like somewhere hope had been left to rot. Gross, I cringed. I found a second light switch near the entrance. For a second I hesitated, then I flipped it. The light that came on was weak at first, then steadier, revealing more of the space in uneven patches, not bright enough to make it feel alive but enough to make it feel real. I walked further in. My footsteps echoed more here than outside, bouncing lightly off metal and concrete in a way that made me more aware of my own presence than I wanted to be, and then I stopped. Somewhere near the center of the floor I just sat down, no chair, no planning, just the cold concrete against my legs, the space stretching out around me like it didn't mind that I was there. For a while I didn't move. The silence inside the warehouse wasn't the same as outside. Outside had distance in it, space that kept things apart. Inside felt closer. The warehouse floor was covered in countless scuff marks. Long black streaks crisscrossed the concrete, the kind left behind by heavy work boots, pallets, forklifts, or movers dragging large equipment across the floor. Noah guessed the marks had probably been there for years. When the warehouse had finally shut down as a commercial storage facility, workers had likely spent days hauling out shelving, machinery, and whatever inventory remained. The scars left behind on the concrete were the final traces of a business that had once been alive, now abandoned to dust, rust, and silence. The air inside the warehouse was damp and carried the unmistakable smell of mold and mildew. Every breath tasted stale, as though the building had been sealed off from the outside world for years. Several patches of dried vomit stained the concrete floor. Unlike the older grime and dirt that had accumulated over decades, these deposits looked relatively recent. Noah guessed they were no more than a year or two old. Maybe a squatter or a transient had taken shelter there for a while. Whoever it had been hadn't cared about the condition of the building, leaving behind another layer of decay in a place that had already been forgotten. The warehouse felt less like an abandoned business and more like a place where desperate people passed through, leaving only traces of their existence behind. Like everything was held in one place and simply waiting for time to pass through it. That was when it came back, not sharply, not suddenly, just slowly, the way a thought drifts in when you stop actively pushing it away.
Tate.
Not a voice, not an image at first, just the feeling of him threaded through everything. I didn't know how to separate anymore. I leaned back slightly, hands resting on the floor behind me, and let my mind do what it always did when I stopped fighting it. It pulled him forward, not the version of him that hurt me, not the version I tried to analyze, decode, or understand when I was angry enough to think clearly, but the earlier version, the one that felt lighter, uncomplicated in a way I didn't fully trust anymore. I saw moments instead of events. Tate laughed in a way that made everything around him feel less serious. The way he used to show up, like he didn't announce himself, just suddenly there, like he had always been part of the space already. The times we wrestled without thinking about what it meant, just noise and movement and breathless laughing that ended too quickly because neither of us wanted to admit we were tired. Sitting too close without moving away, not because it was planned, because it didn't feel like something that needed planning. It was easier back then in a way that only makes sense when you're no longer inside it. I pressed my hand to the floor again, grounding myself in the present, but the memories didn't fade. They layered instead, one over the other, like the warehouse itself had decided to hold them with me. I could almost hear the echo of it, his voice not clearly but suggested, like a sound remembered more than heard. The feeling of being near him without needing to explain why that nearness existed. And that was the part that hurt in a way I didn't always have words for, because it wasn't just missing him. It was missing the version of things where I didn't have to question what anything meant. Where closeness didn't feel like something that could shift underneath you later. The warehouse stayed quiet around me, no answers, no interruption, just space. I don't know how long I sat there like that. Time didn't really register in a straight line inside that place. It bent a little, or maybe I just stopped tracking it properly. At some point I realized my shoulders had dropped, that I wasn't holding myself as tightly as I had been outside, that something about being inside had made everything slightly heavier but also slightly easier to carry. That contradiction didn't make sense either, nothing about this did. And yet I stayed, because loneliness has a way of making unfamiliar places feel like they were designed for you specifically, even when you know that isn't true. I looked around the warehouse again, the light buzzed faintly overhead. Dust drifted through the beam as it had nowhere else to be. The emptiness wasn't empty in the way outside emptiness was. It felt structured, contained, like it had rules. It knew how to hold things without breaking them, and I wondered, not for the first time, why this place. Why here? Why him? In my head, always here. I thought about all the times I'd sat outside and felt that presence I couldn't explain. How it never felt threatening, never felt like something pushing in, more like something already there waiting for me to notice it. I let myself stay in the memory longer than I usually did. Not the betrayal, not the confusion, just the good parts I had started avoiding because they made everything else harder to sort. The way it felt when we were actually okay. When nothing was being measured or interpreted or pulled apart later, just existing in the same moment without needing to label it. That version of him felt closer here too, which was the part I didn't know what to do with because I had come here expecting distance. Instead, I got memory, and something that still felt like him even when I knew it couldn't be. I exhaled slowly and leaned my head back against the cold air. The warehouse didn't change, it didn't comfort me, it didn't explain anything. It just held the silence while I sat inside it, caught between what happened and what I still couldn't fully let go of. And for the first time that night, I stopped trying to force an answer out of it. Because at least here, nothing was expected of me. Now, years later, I was back in the same place, same tree, same blue deserted warehouse, same quiet that didn't belong to anyone, only I wasn't 18 anymore, and what I carried into this parking lot wasn't confusion or shock the way it had been back then. It was recognition, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that tells you you've been here before in ways that aren't just physical. What stayed sharper was the pattern itself, not the people, the leaving, the not having anywhere else to put myself when things inside me got too heavy to carry in rooms with other people in them, and as I sat there I understood something I didn't like but couldn't unsee. I didn't just come back to places like this when I was at my lowest. I came back when I didn't know how to stay anywhere else. The warehouse was a pretty blue color, the kind that didn't quite match the rest of the area. It stood out in a way that felt unintentional, like it used to belong somewhere else and got dropped here and just stayed. Time had softened it though. The paint was faded in places, chipped in others, but it still held onto that blue like it was refusing to fully disappear. I had gone inside a few weeks ago, right before I left on the cruise. I remember it clearly now in a way I didn't want to at the time. The door wasn't properly locked, just heavy and reluctant like it expected me to turn away. Inside, it smelled like dust and old metal and silence that had been building up for years. Empty space has its own kind of weight, you don't notice it until you step into it and realize how loud nothing can be. I walked through it slowly, no real purpose, just looking. The floor was worn in patterns and shoes scuffed that suggested it had once mattered more than it did now. Light came in through high windows in broken strips, cutting the space into uneven shapes. I remember thinking it felt honest in a strange way, not pretending to be anything it wasn't, not performing. At the time I thought about buying it. The idea came quietly without much structure, not as a practical decision, not as an investment, but as something symbolic, a way of holding on to a version of myself that still felt connected to everything that had happened here, the versions of me that had come to this place when I didn't know where else to go. The idea was simple in my head. If I owned it, maybe it wouldn't feel like something I was still being pushed away from. Maybe it would feel like something I had chosen to keep. A marker of the past, something I could control, but I never did it, not because I couldn't and not because it wasn't possible, but because standing inside it made the idea feel different from what it had been in my head. Ownership wouldn't have changed what it already meant. It wouldn't have turned it into something safer or cleaner or less complicated. It would have just added another layer of attachment to something that was already heavy enough on its own. So I left it as it was, and then I left for the cruise in 1990. Now standing or sitting really back in front of it again, I could see how much of a pattern that decision had been. Wanting to turn something painful into something I could keep, as if numbing it or buying it or claiming it would make it less capable of hurting me, as if permanence could replace resolution. But places don't work like that, they stay what they are, and so do the memories attached to them. And maybe that was the only real thing it had ever been. I fell asleep around 10 o'clock, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day, while my body rested on the hard, dirty floor. A nightmare dragged me under before I even realized I'd fallen asleep. In it, something had hold of me, cold, unseen hands gripping my arms, pulling me backward across the gravel and through the warehouse door. I tried to fight it, tried to dig my heels in, but there was nothing to push against. The floor scraped under me, the darkness swallowing everything, and then I was inside again, but not the same. The air was heavier, pressing down on my chest as if it wanted me still. I felt it pin me there, force me flat against the ground, something moving through me instead of just holding me. Not pain exactly, worse, like being erased and rewritten at the same time. Like I wasn't fully in control of my own body anymore. I woke with a violent start, a sound tearing out of my throat before I could stop it. My chest heaved as I stared into the darkness, the warehouse ceiling above me barely visible, the weak light flickering like it might go out at any second. For a moment I couldn't tell what was real, if I was still inside the dream or if I had actually been dragged somewhere without realizing it. My hands were shaking once I awoke from my nightmare. I forced myself to sit up, to look around, to anchor myself in something solid. The same empty space. The same quiet, nothing moving, nothing there, just me. I pulled my wrist closer and checked my watch. The glow was faint but enough. My nightmare had been intense, terrifying in a way that didn't fade just because I was awake. My whole body felt like it had been pulled through it and left there too long. I had broken out in a sweat, cold and clinging, goosebumps rising along my arms despite the damp heat on my skin. My hair was soaked, sticking to my forehead and neck, and my chest was drenched, each breath sharp and uneven as I tried to steady it. For a moment, I couldn't tell if the chill running through me belonged to the dream or the warehouse itself, only that it lingered, refusing to let go. 3 in the morning, the number sat there longer than it should have, like it carried more weight than just time. Then it hit me. June 12th. The day landed hard in my chest, heavier than the dream had been, Tate's wedding, and underneath that deeper, sharper, the anniversary of Joey's death. A humor so dark it almost circled back to being cruel. Of course, Tate would choose a date like this. Of course, everything would overlap in the worst possible way, like the past and present couldn't exist separately without colliding. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, trying to steady my breathing. The warehouse felt different now, not threatening, not haunted in any real sense, just aware in a way I couldn't explain, like it was holding the weight of what I just remembered along with me. I swallowed hard, my throat still tight from the scream. "I wish you were still here," I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Joey." He would have known what to say, or at least he would have said something that cut through all of this, through Tate, through the confusion, through the way everything still felt tangled no matter how much time passed. He always had a way of making things simple without making them feel small. I let out a slow breath, staring at the concrete floor. I don't know what to do anymore. The admission stayed there in the air, unanswered, and for once the silence didn't even pretend to sound like Tate. "Hey kid." The voice came so suddenly that Noah's breath caught before he even had time to process it. Noah blinked, and for a second, just a second, he saw him. Joey. Standing near the edge of the warehouse, light like he had never really left it. Casual posture, that same familiar expression as if he just walked in from somewhere normal and not something final. Noah's heart dropped hard in his chest. This can't be real. The thought came instantly, automatically, like a reflex. I must need sleep, Noah whispered under his breath. I'm starting to hallucinate. But Joey didn't disappear. If anything, he seemed clearer for a moment, more defined, like the warehouse itself had decided to sharpen him into focus. Noah took a step back without meaning to. Should I go to the wedding? Noah asked quietly, almost like he didn't trust his own voice. I don't even know why I'm asking you. Joey let out a short laugh, not mocking, not kind either, just familiar. Tate is cruel, Joey said. The words landed heavier than Noah expected. His stomach tightened slightly. Joey tilted his head, watching him. He's getting married on the anniversary of my death, he continued, on purpose. Noah's throat went dry. That's not, Noah started, then stopped. Because the sentence didn't know how to finish itself, Joey's expression didn't change much, but his voice stayed steady. So he can spit on my grave, he said. A pause, then softer but sharper underneath. Don't believe anything Tate tells you, Noah. Noah's pulse ticked up. You still think you knew him better than anyone, Joey said softly. Noah swallowed but didn't answer. Joey gave a faint smile. And maybe by the end you did, but I knew Tate first. He folded his arms. I was there when he was little. I took care of him, I spoiled him, I took him places, I watched him become the man you loved. Joey glanced toward the cracked warehouse floor before looking back at Noah. Tate wasn't emotionally neglected because Terrence and Talia didn't love him. They did. They were good parents, good people. Talia tried harder than anyone will ever know. He sighed. But love isn't always enough. They never quite figured out how to connect with a little boy who experienced the world differently. Tate needed constant emotional reassurance. He needed to feel completely safe before he could truly attach himself to someone. Joey's expression softened. You gave him that. You became the safest person in his world. He didn't have to pretend around you, he didn't have to impress you. Around you, he could simply be Tate. Joey took a slow step closer. But that safety came with fear. If he thought someone was choosing work, school, travel, or another person over him, he didn't see it as life getting in the way. He experienced it as abandonment. You remember when you went on that cruise with Mark? Noah nodded silently. Joey chuckled without humor. Years later, Tate accused me of taking you away from him, as though I'd convinced you to write to me. He couldn't separate temporary distance from permanent loss. Joey's eyes drifted toward the darkness filling the warehouse. And that's what has haunted me. For years, he couldn't stand the thought of losing you. He'd panic if he thought you were slipping away. He wanted to sleep beside you. He wanted to know where you were. He wanted you close. Then Joey looked back at Noah. So explain something to me. How does a man who's terrified of being abandoned become the man who abandons the person who made him feel safest? The ghost slowly shook his head. I've been asking myself that ever since June 2nd. His voice became almost a whisper. I don't know whether fear finally won, or whether he convinced himself you were strong enough to survive without him. Joey met Noah's eyes. But I do know this. What he did changed you. You don't look at people the same way anymore. You don't hand out trust the way you handed it to Tate. You don't believe promises the way you used to. The ghost looked around the abandoned warehouse. This place is falling apart because everyone walked away from it. Then he looked back at Noah. Don't let your heart become another abandoned building. With that, Joey's outline began to fade into the darkness until only the sound of dripping water remained. "You're wrong," Noah said automatically, but it came out uncertain even to him. Joey didn't react to that. "He's a liar," Joey said instead. "He used you for years." Noah shook his head slightly, as he could physically push the words away. "No." But the denial didn't have weight behind it. Joey stepped closer, not invading, just present in a way that made the warehouse feel smaller. "And now," Joey continued, "that you're no longer convenient or useful." He paused just long enough for it to sting. "He's thrown you away." Noah's chest tightened. "That's not true," Noah said, but his voice was quieter now. Joey's eyes stayed on him. "And replaced you with Chloe." That one hit differently, not because it made sense, but because it didn't, because it collided with too many unfinished pieces in Noah's head at once. Noah pressed a hand to his forehead. "Stop," Noah whispered, "just stop." Joey didn't raise his voice. "I warned you," Joey explained. His words were said with care, trying to tell Noah the truth even if Noah resisted. A pause. "I warned you to stay away from him." The warehouse felt still again, too still. It was waiting for Noah to decide what reality he was going to accept next. Noah looked up. "Joey," he said quietly, unsure if he was asking for help or confirmation or something else entirely. But Joey didn't answer the way Noah expected, because in the next moment the edges of him began to blur just slightly, like a photograph losing focus at the corners, and Noah couldn't tell if Joey was fatting, or if Noah's mind was finally running out of ways to keep him there. Joey turns slightly, like he's addressing someone who isn't there. "If you really want revenge against Tate for abandoning you," he says, voice low and even, "then show up with Mark, stay 10 minutes, let him see it, let him sit with it, and then leave." Noah stiffens. "That's not." Joey keeps going anyway, like the thought is already finished in his mind. "Make it clear his wedding isn't something you're going to revolve your life around anymore. Bring Mark, the guy Tate always hated, the one he was jealous of around you. Walk in, let him see you're fine, and walk out." Noah's stomach twists. "That sounds like I'm just turning it into a game." Joey looks at him for a long second. The edges of him feel too steady to be real. "It already is a game to him," he says. "You're just the only one still playing it as it matters." Noah stands there for a long moment, jaw tight, eyes unfocused, like he's trying to decide whether the thought even belongs to him. 10 minutes. In and out, no staying, no proving anything. It shouldn't matter, but it does. He exhales slowly. "I hate that this even makes sense," he mutters. Joey doesn't move, just waits. Noah swallows, then nods once, small, reluctant, but real enough in the moment. "No," he says quietly, "I'm done with Tate, I won't go there." The warehouse seems to loosen around him after that, like the air has stopped pushing back so hard. Noah is half asleep when his phone starts buzzing against the cold ground beside the warehouse. He doesn't look at the screen at first, just blindly reaches for it, expecting silence, expecting nothing. "Hello," his voice is rough, barely awake. "Dude, Noah," Jack's drunk voice crackles through, loud and urgent, like he's somewhere noisy. Noah squints up at the dim sky. "Jack, what time is it?" "I don't even know, late." "Listen, are you sitting down?" Noah shifts slightly against the concrete wall, suddenly more alert. "Why, what happened?" Jack exhales like he's been holding this in. "It's Tate, he's at his bachelor party right now." Noah pauses just a beat too long. "Okay." "And it's kind of a mess," Jack continues. "Like he's been drinking, there are people there, girls." Noah sits up a little straighter, eyes narrowing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you weren't there and I thought you should know," Jack says quickly. He's acting like, "Look, I don't know, man, he's all over the place." Noah's grip tightens around the phone. "I don't care what he's doing." There's a sound in the background of Jack's call, laughter, music, voices overlapping. Then another voice cuts through. "Tate." Noah freezes, it's distant but unmistakable. And then a woman's voice, laughing, too close to the phone, too casual, like she's right there beside him. Noah's chest tightens instantly. Jack notices the silence. "Noah." Noah doesn't answer right away. His eyes are fixed on nothing, jaw locking. "That's him," Noah says finally, voice low and jealous. "Yeah, look, I didn't mean for you to hear." But Noah isn't listening anymore. The sound in the background shifts again, Tate's voice, laughing, loose, careless, another voice responding. Too many people, too close. Something in Noah's chest snaps from confusion into heat. Why are you even calling me? Noah asks sharply. Because I thought you'd want to know. I don't, Noah cuts in immediately. A pause. Jack tries again, softer. Noah, he's not exactly being subtle about moving on tonight by fucking 50 girls. That lands harder than Noah wants it to. His throat tightens, Tate can do whatever he wants. But even as he says it, his grip on the phone is shaking slightly. Another burst of laughter in the background. Tate's voice again, closer this time, distorted by the phone but still him. Noah closes his eyes. For a second he sees it too clearly, Tate in a room full of people not thinking about him at all. The thought hits wrong, too sharp, too personal. Noah, Jack slurs, you still there? Noah opens his eyes slowly, his voice is quieter now but edged. Yeah, I'm here. You okay? Noah laughs once, but it isn't real. Why wouldn't I be? Jack hesitates. I didn't mean to upset you. You didn't, Noah lied flatly. But his expression says otherwise. There's another burst of sound from Jack's end, music, someone shouting Tate's name, glass clinking. Noah pulls the phone slightly away from his ear like it suddenly burns. Noah can hear Tate fucking a woman near Jack, his ex-bedfellow moaning while the whore he fucks encourages him. Noah is jealous, so jealous that he makes an excuse to avoid dialogue with Jack anymore. I've got to go, Noah says. Wait, Noah. But he's already ending the call. The screen goes dark. Silence rushes back in so fast it feels loud. Noah sits there outside the warehouse, phone still in his hand, staring at nothing. His breathing is controlled but tight. Slowly his grip tightens around the phone until his knuckles pale. Then he exhales through his nose, shaking his head once. Of course Tate would be fucking the night before a major event. Noah remembered his own 18th birthday, the Tina fiasco in college, his Brown graduation, Joey's funeral, and Tate unbuckling his Calvin Kleins and having sex with the nearest available whore in Lowe's Angels. He mutters under his breath. Tate had sex at inappropriate moments with cheap women, probably to shock his family or escape accountability. Noah kept circling the same question, as if worrying it like a loose thread might finally make it unravel. Why did Tate always reach for carnal intimacy when anything real threatened to surface? It wasn't even subtle anymore. The pattern had sharpened over the years into something almost predictable. Whenever grief lingered too close, whenever accountability hovered in the air waiting to be claimed, Tate would disappear into someone else's body, into distraction, into noise. It was like he had trained himself to replace feeling with sensation, to overwrite anything uncomfortable with something immediate and physical. The worst part was how easily everyone else seemed to accept it, how it had been quietly reinforced. Be with women, people would say, as if that was the cure for everything: confusion, guilt, loss. Even Talia, his own mother, had noticed it, though she never pushed hard enough to stop it. Noah had seen it long before she ever said a word. At Joey's funeral, the realization had landed heavier than ever. Tate's timing, his entrance, the calculated way he slipped into the moment, it all felt off. He had come in late, not disheveled from rushing, not burdened by grief, but composed in a way that felt almost rehearsed. And then there was that gesture, Tate's arm sliding around Noah, casual on the surface but loaded underneath. Noah couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't meant for comfort at all. It was a performance, maybe for Mark. Maybe for everyone watching, maybe even for himself. A way to redirect attention, to rewrite the narrative in real time. And Noah had stood there, frozen in it, aware of how wrong it felt and yet unable to pull away. The thought that followed made something twist in his stomach. Tate hadn't been late because of traffic. Noah didn't believe that, not anymore. The excuse was too easy, too convenient. It fit the same pattern Tate always used: deflect, distract, deny. If anything, Noah suspected the truth was uglier, harder to admit out loud. Tate had probably been with a girl before Joey's funeral, probably chasing that same hollow distraction he always did, even on a day that should have meant something. Even on the day they buried Joey. The idea felt cruel, almost unbearable, that while everyone else was gathering pieces of themselves to mourn, Tate had been somewhere else entirely, chasing pleasure, escaping responsibility, and refusing to sit with even the barest edge of grief. And that was the part Noah couldn't reconcile. It wasn't just avoidance, it felt like disrespect. Like Tate was actively choosing not to feel anything that might crack him open, even if it meant dishonoring someone who mattered. Joey hadn't been anything. He had been family, complicated, flawed, but still family. And yet Tate treated the moment like something to get through, something to manage rather than experience. There was no stillness in him, no visible weight of loss. Just that same practiced charm, that same deflection, that same unsettling ease. Noah hated that he noticed all of it, hated that he could read Tate so clearly and still not understand him. Because underneath the frustration, underneath the anger, there was something worse, the quiet, persistent hope that maybe Tate wasn't as empty as he seemed. That maybe all of this, the women, the timing, the distance, wasn't indifference but fear. That Tate didn't know how to sit with grief or guilt or love without feeling like it would consume him. But that hope didn't make it easier to watch. If anything, it made it harder. Because it meant Tate was choosing this over and over again, choosing avoidance, choosing surface over depth, choosing anything that kept him from being truly seen. And Noah was left standing there again, wondering if Tate would ever stop running, or if this was all he would ever be. Noah kept returning to the same fragile explanation, turning it over carefully as if it might break in his hands. Maybe it wasn't a choice at all. Maybe Tate had never learned how to grow into the moments that demanded something real from him. Arrested development, that was the phrase Noah clung to because it sounded clinical, almost merciful. It suggested a delay instead of a defect, a reason instead of a failure. If Tate had been stunted somewhere along the way, if something in him had frozen before it could fully form, then maybe this was all he was capable of. Maybe expecting more from him was like asking someone to speak a language they'd never been taught. It would explain so much. The way Tate deflected seriousness with charm. The way he turned grief into something physical, something he could outrun. The way he seemed almost confused by emotional weight, like it didn't quite register the same way for him. Noah had seen it too many times for it to be a coincidence. Funerals, apologies, moments that demanded stillness and accountability. Tate never quite met them. He sidestepped them, replaced them, reshaped them into something easier to digest. And if it was arrested development, then maybe he couldn't help it. Maybe his emotional range had limits he didn't even recognize. Noah wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that because the alternative was harder to sit with. If it wasn't something broken or stunted, if it wasn't a gap in Tate's development or some invisible barrier he couldn't cross, then it meant Tate was choosing this. Choosing again and again to prioritize pleasure over presence. Choosing to avoid his family when they needed him. Choosing to show up half-formed to moments that demanded everything. And that kind of choice wasn't accidental. It wasn't something you could soften with explanations or dress up in clinical language. It was deliberate, it was selfish. That thought lodged itself somewhere deep in Noah's chest, heavy and immovable. Because if Tate could help it, if he understood exactly what he was doing and simply didn't care enough to change, then all of Noah's careful justifications collapsed. There would be no hidden reason to uncover, no quiet excuse waiting to be discovered and forgiven. There would just be Tate exactly as he was, someone who knew what was expected of him and chose something easier instead. And Noah didn't know which version was worse. The boy who couldn't feel deeply enough to show up, or the man who could and decided not to. He tried to hold onto the first version, the softer one. The version where Tate wasn't cruel, just incapable. It made everything easier to bear. It allowed Noah to keep loving him without feeling foolish, without feeling like he was investing in something hollow. It gave him a reason to stay patient, to keep hopping, to keep explaining Tate to himself in ways that didn't hurt as much. But that other thought, the sharper one, the uglier one, wouldn't leave him alone. It crept in during quiet moments, pressing against the back of his mind with uncomfortable clarity. It pointed out the details Noah wished he could ignore. How selective Tate's inability seemed to be, how easily he navigated situations that benefited him, how quickly he adapted when something he wanted was at stake. That didn't look like incapacity, that looked like a choice. And the more Noah noticed it, the harder it became to pretend otherwise. Maybe it wasn't arrested development. Maybe it wasn't something that could be explained or softened or fixed. Maybe Tate understood grief just fine, understood it well enough to avoid it, to reject it, to replace it with something that made him feel powerful instead of vulnerable. Thought turned bitter in Noah's mouth, because if that was true, then there was no deeper reason hiding underneath Tate's behavior, no secret wound that justified everything, no invisible limitation that excused how he showed up or failed to be there for his family or Noah. There was just Tate, self-contained, self-protective, self-serving, selfish to the bone. Noah standing just close enough to Tate to see it clearly, but still close enough to wish it wasn't true, while the blonde knew it was without a doubt.